The piano began playing on its own, the keys pressing down as if unseen hands controlled. I stepped back, but a piercing scream erupted from the instrument, raw, human, and agonized. The lid snapped open, revealing a bloodied face staring up at me. "Help me," it rasped, just as a shadow lunged from behind and dragged me toward the piano. The storm pounded against the windows of the bar, the winds howling like a distant scream that wouldn't stop. The place was nearly empty, just me at the piano, the bartender wiping the same glass for the last 10 minutes, and one shadowy figure sitting in the far corner. I tried to focus on the keys in front of me, but the air felt heavy, oppressive, like something was watching me. I started playing a familiar tune, one I'd practiced 100 times before. But tonight the piano felt wrong. The keys were cold, sticky, like something wet had been spilled on them. A sour, metallic smell lingered in the air, faint but unmistakable. I kept playing, telling myself it was just my nerves. Then it happened. A loud, dissonant chord erupted, jarring me so hard I jumped. My hands hadn't moved. I froze, staring at the piano, the sound still vibrating through the air. The bartender didn't flinch, didn't even glance my way. My stomach churned. Before I could make sense of it, the piano began to play on its own. Slow, deliberate notes echoed through the bar, each one louder than the last. My heart pounded as I backed away from the bench, but I couldn't look away. The melody twisted into something dark, something wrong. The keys moved like they were being pressed by invisible hands. And then the scream came. A high-pitched, agonized wail that filled the room, too human to be the trick of the wind. I clapped my hands over my ears, but it was useless. The sound was everywhere, inside me, crawling under my skin. The lid of the piano snapped open with a violent crack, and I saw it. A bloodied face stared up at me from inside the piano, its eyes wide and pleading, its mouth twisted in a scream that wouldn't stop. "Help me," it rasped, the voice raw and broken. My legs buckled, and I hit the floor hard, but I couldn't take my eyes off it. The bartender was gone, the shadowy figure in the corner nowhere to be seen. The face inside the piano twisted, its features contorting into something unrecognizable, something monstrous. The screaming stopped abruptly, replaced by a whisper that felt like it was being breathed directly into my ear. "You shouldn't have come here." 2 nights before, my life had been different. Desperate but different. Rent was overdue, my fridge was empty, and the few gigs I'd managed to book had all fallen through. I spent hours scrolling through my phone, praying for a miracle, when Matt's name popped up. His text was, "Short, can you cover my shifts at Silent Keys?" I didn't think twice before replying. Matt and I had been friends for years, and the extra cash sounded like a godsend. But when I showed up at the Silent Keys, I realized something was off. The bar looked ancient, its wooden sign creaking in the wind. Inside, it was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of old wood and stale beer. Mr. Finch, the owner, was waiting for me. He was tall and thin, with a face that didn't match his age, like he'd been stretched too tight over the years. His smile didn't reach his eyes when he handed me a wad of cash up front. "Just play the piano," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "No matter what happens, don't stop. Until midnight." I laughed nervously, thinking he was trying to be dramatic. "What, is it haunted?" I joked. His expression didn't change. "Just don't stop playing." I should have walked out then. But the money felt solid in my pocket, a lifeline I couldn't afford to turn down. The piano sat in the corner of the bar, old and scarred. The keys were scratched, and faint red stains dotted their surface. My fingers hovered over them, but a chill ran up my spine before I even touched them. When I started to play, the notes sounded hollow, like they were being swallowed by the room. And the air, it felt colder the longer I sat there, like the piano was breathing its icy breath on me. I told myself it was just my nerves, but deep down, something felt wrong. That night, I dreamed of the piano. In my dream, it wasn't a piano at all, it was a black maw, a gaping hole filled with teeth and screams. And I was falling into it, the keys pulling me down, one by one. B. The first night was meant to be simple. Play the piano, collect my money, and leave. But nothing. God, it was simple. The moment I sat at that piano, the room felt off like the air was thicker. Around me, pressing on my chest. I could barely focus, but I told myself it was just nerves. After all, this was my first gig in weeks, and my hands hadn't touched real keys in too long. The patrons were strange from the start. They barely drank, barely moved. Most of them sat, hunched over, whispering to one another like they were sharing secrets too dark to be spoken aloud. A few stared at me, not at my hands, or the music, but directly at me, their eyes hollow and unblinking. One man sat in the far corner, his face hidden in shadows, no matter how many times I glanced his way. He didn't move. It was as if he were carved into the darkness. I began to play, sticking to safe, familiar songs. The keys felt different under my fingers, colder. And they should have been. A strange chill crept up my arms as I moved through the melody, the notes reverberating unnaturally in the empty space. The sound wasn't right. It echoed too. Long, stretching out like something alive. But I pushed through, my nerves tingling with every chord. It happened during my second set. A wrong note. I didn't mean to press it, at least I didn't think. I did. The moment the dissonant sound rang out, the lights above flickered, and I swear the entire bar seemed to hold its breath. The patrons froze mid-motion, their heads snapping toward me in unison. My heart hammered against my ribs as I stumbled over the next few notes, trying to pretend nothing had happened. Then I saw it. The glossy surface of the piano caught a reflection, shadowy figures moving behind me. I whipped my head around, expecting to see someone standing there, but there was nothing. Just empty space and the low hum of the bar's outdated refrigerator. My hands shook. As I returned to the keys, the music now a shaky, uneven mess. By the end of the night, I was desperate to leave, but something held me back. A nagging feeling that I needed to know what I'd just experienced. After the bar closed, I wandered into the storage room, searching for something, anything that could explain the unease curling in my gut. That's when I found it. Matt's old bag was shoved in the corner, dusty and forgotten. Inside, his journal lay battered, its pages filled with frantic handwriting. Words like voices, eyes watching, and keys that move on their own were scrawled in jagged lines across the pages. One entry stopped me cold. It wants more than music. It wants me. The last page made my stomach drop. In bold, smeared letters, it read, "Don't stop playing." I should have quit after the first night. But I didn't. The money was good, better than anything else I could find in Matt's journal felt more like paranoia than truth. That's what I told myself. Anyway, but when I walked into the Silent Keys on the second night, the bar seemed darker, the air colder. It felt as if the building itself knew I had come back. This time the crowd was even stranger. There were fewer of them, but the ones who showed up seemed more lifeless, more unnatural. One man at the bar sipped from an empty glass, his hand moving mechanically, as though he didn't notice there was no drink left. The shadowed figure from the night before was there again, sitting in the same corner, still unmoving. I sat at the piano, my body tense. The memory of the wrong note lingered in my mind, but I told myself it had been a coincidence. Still, the keys felt even colder tonight, and the metallic smell from before was sharper now, stinging my nose. I began to play, forcing my fingers to move through the melody. At first, everything seemed fine until it wasn't. As I moved into the second song, the piano began adding notes to the melody. My fingers weren't pressing the keys, but they moved. Anyway, like invisible hands were guiding them. The music turned dark, disjointed, the kind of melody that crawls under your skin and makes you want to run. The patrons reacted immediately. They began to sway, their movements slow and unnatural as those strings were pulling their bodies. One man whispered something, his voice so low I could barely hear it. Its waking up his head lulled back, and he slumped forward, face first into his drink. I wanted to stop. God, I wanted to stop so badly. But Finch's words from the first night echoed in my mind, don't stop playing. So I kept going, my hands trembling as the music grew heavier, darker. It felt like the piano was draining me, pulling the energy from my body with every note. After the shift, I was alone again, the bar silent except for the low hum of the storm outside. But the silence didn't last. I heard it faint cries coming from inside the piano. My breath caught in my throat as I hesitated, my fingers hovering over the lid. Slowly, I lifted it. A shadowy figure writhed within the strings, its form shifting and twisting like smoke caught in a windless room. Its face was indistinct, but its voice was sharp, a mix of anger and pain. You're. Next it growled, the words slicing through me like a blade. I slammed the lid shut and stumbled back, my heart racing. The storm outside roared louder, but inside the bar was deathly still. I knew then that this wasn't just a haunted piano. It was something worse. And it wasn't done with me. The storm raged harder as I pushed through the heavy wooden doors of the Silent Keys. Rain lashed against the windows, the wind screaming like it wanted to rip the building apart. My head spun with the memory of the night before the bloodied face in the piano, Matt's journal with its cryptic warnings, the shadowy figures watching me from the corners of the bar. I was barely holding it together, but I had to know what was going on. I slammed the journal down on the counter in front of Finch, its pages open to Matt's frantic scrawls. What is this? I demanded, my voice shaking. What happened to Matt? Finch looked up from the glass he was polishing, his expression unreadable. He didn't even glance at the journal. The bar has its quirks, he said, his tone so calm it made my skin crawl. You're better off not asking questions. Just keep playing. That's not an answer, I snapped. What's wrong with that piano? What's wrong with this place? Finch's thin lips curled into a smile, but his eyes stayed cold. You're still alive, aren't you? That's all that matters. I wanted to scream at him, to grab him by the collar and shake him until he gave me a real answer, but something about the way he stood there, so still and unaffected, froze me in place. It was like he was untouchable, like nothing I said or did could reach him. When I finally turned away, my hands trembling, I decided to leave. I didn't care about the money anymore. I just wanted to get out. But the moment I stepped outside, the storm swallowed me whole. The rain was so heavy I could barely see a foot in front of me, and the wind pushed me back toward the bar like it was alive. I tried to call for a ride, but my phone refused to work. The screen flickered, the battery drained in seconds, and the only thing I could hear through the static was a faint, distorted melody like the piano's cursed notes were following me. I went back inside, defeated. My shoes squelched against the wooden floor as I sat at the bar, my head in my hands. That's when I saw her. She was sitting at one of the tables, so pale she almost glowed in the dim light. Her hollow eyes locked onto mine, and I froze. I hadn't seen her come in. She hadn't been there a moment ago. You're playing the piano now, she said, her voice soft but firm, like she already knew the answer. What night are you on? Second, I said cautiously, my throat dry. Who are you? Clara, she said, standing slowly. Her movements were stiff, unnatural. I used to play here. The air around her seemed to shift, growing colder with each step she took toward me. The piano is a doorway, she continued. It feeds on us to stay open. You're lucky to still be alive, but it won't last. Whatever you do, don't stop playing. That's the only thing keeping it from dragging you in. I opened my mouth to ask what she meant, but before I could speak, her body began to crumble. Tiny flakes of ash broke off her skin, floating into the air and vanishing. Her face remained calm, even as the edges of her mouth and eyes disintegrated. You're running out of time, she whispered, her voice echoing unnaturally as she disappeared entirely, leaving nothing behind but a faint trace of dust on the floor. By the third night, I felt like I was being hollowed out. Every step I took felt heavier, every breath harder. The air inside the bar pressed against me like an invisible weight, and the piano, I didn't even want to look at it. But I didn't have a choice. Finch was nowhere to be seen, and the patrons were gone. The only ones left were the shadows, shifting and flickering at the edges of the room like they were waiting for something. I sat at the bench, my hands shaking as I placed them on the keys. The first notes came out wrong. They didn't match what I was playing, twisting into a discordant melody that made my stomach churn. The keys beneath my fingers grew hot, burning against my skin, but I couldn't stop. The melody pulled me in, forcing my hands to move faster, harder, until my fingers started to bleed. Bright red streaks smeared across the ivory keys, and the piano seemed to drink it in, humming with a low, guttural vibration. The room darkened around me, the shadows closing in. They weren't just flickers anymore, they had form, shape. They circled the piano like predators stalking prey, their hollow faces turned toward me. They began to chant, their voices low and rhythmic, in a language I couldn't understand. The sound crawled into my ears, twisting through my head like barbed wire. Then it appeared. The shadow from the piano. It stepped out of the instrument like it had been hiding there all along, its form tall and jagged, its edges blurring as it moved closer. It leaned over me, its presence suffocating. My hands kept playing, even as I wanted to scream, even as the blood dripped from my fingertips. Play the final melody, it rasped, its voice a low, bone-deep vibration. Finish the ritual. What happens if I stop? I choked out, my voice barely above a whisper. Its hollow face tilted toward mine, the darkness where its eyes should have been locking onto me. You already know. Oh, my stomach dropped. The piano wasn't just cursed. It was a prison for something ancient, something evil. And if I played what it wanted, I'd be the one to set it free. The piano stood before me like a gaping mouth, waiting to swallow me whole. The shadows had receded slightly, their amorphous forms flickering at the edges of the room like dying embers. But I could still feel them, watching, breathing, waiting. My hands hovered over the keys, trembling with exhaustion and terror. I didn't know how much more I could take. My body felt drained, my fingers bloodied from the sharp edges of the keys that had somehow cut into my skin. But the journal's words echoed in. My mind played the opposite melody. Disrupt its energy. Matt had known something it didn't, something that had cost him his life. And now it was my only chance. The shadow inside the piano began to rise again, taller and darker than before, its jagged edges blurring into the air around it. Its voice was a guttural growl, resonating deep in my chest. Play. The final melody it commanded. Set me free. No, I whispered, though my voice barely broke the silence. I slammed my hands onto the keys, forcing out a discordant series of notes that didn't belong to the melody it had been feeding me. The sound ripped through the air like jagged glass, and the shadow recoiled, screeching in rage. The piano fought me. The keys resisted under my fingers, some snapping upward as if they were alive, trying to bite at my hands. A deep, vibrating hum emanated from the instrument, rattling through the floorboards. It felt as though the entire bar was alive, its walls trembling with an unseen pulse. You can't win, the shadow hissed, its form stretching across the ceiling like smoke. You'll only make it worse. Each note I played sent another wave of vibrations through the room, and the shadows. Movements grew more frantic, more violent. The air grew thick and stifling like I was breathing in smoke. My vision blurred as the room began to spin, the shadows around me flickering like flames. My fingers ached, the pain shooting up my arms with every note, but I couldn't stop. I wouldn't stop. The melody I was playing didn't feel like music, it felt like a fight, each note clawing against the cursed energy that seeped from the piano. The dissonance grew louder, sharper. Like the sound itself was cutting through the darkness. The shadow lunged toward me, its form solidifying into a towering figure with hollow eyes and a mouth that stretched too wide. It reached for me, its clawed hands inches from my face. My heart stopped as I played one final, broken chord. The sound exploded outward, a deafening, shattering wave that rippled through the room. The shadow let out an unearthly scream, its form splitting apart like smoke caught in a violent wind. The piano shook violently beneath my hands, its wood splintering and cracking. The final note rang out, and the room fell silent. I collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air. The piano was destroyed, its once polished surface now a pile of jagged shards. But the shadows were gone. The oppressive weight in the air had lifted, leaving only the faint echo of that last haunting chord. I thought it was over. But as I sat there, staring at the broken piano, I realized the silence wasn't complete. Faintly, from somewhere deep within the shattered remains, I heard it again. And the melody, still playing. The air in the bar felt heavy, like it was pressing down on my chest, squeezing the breath out of me. The shadow loomed over the piano now, its jagged form stretching higher and wider, filling the room with darkness. Its voice was a low, guttural snarl, vibrating through my bones. "Cannot stop this," it growled. "You are too late." The piano trembled under my hands, its wood creaking like it was alive, protesting the melody I was forcing through it. My fingers ached, the skin raw and slick with blood where the sharp edges of the keys had cut me. I couldn't stop playing, not now. The discordant notes I pounded out echoed through the room, fighting against the oppressive hum that came from the shadow itself. The walls of the bar began to crack, thin lines spidering across the plaster. Dust and splinters rained down, the sound mingling with the eerie, unearthly howl that erupted from the shadow as I pushed harder, playing louder. Each note felt like a blow, like I was hitting it with every ounce of strength I had left. Enough, the shadow roared, surging toward me. Its clawed hand reached out, inches from my throat. I closed my eyes and slammed my hands down on the keys, a final, broken chord tearing through the air. The sound exploded outward, shattering everything. The shadow screamed, its form twisting and fracturing before it was sucked back into the piano. The instrument cracked and splintered, imploding into itself with a deafening roar. Then, silence. When I opened my eyes, the bar was a wreck, cracks in the walls, overturned tables, and shattered glass. The piano was gone, but in the silence I swore I heard a single, faint note, still playing, waiting. I woke up sprawled on the pavement, my body drenched from head to toe. The rain was relentless, chilling me to the bone. My head throbbed, and every muscle in my body felt as if it had been wrung dry. I didn't remember how I'd gotten here outside the bar, the wreckage of the silent keys, nothing more than a burned-out husk behind me. I sat up slowly, the night unnaturally quiet, except for the steady drumming of the rain. The bar looked wrong, like it had been abandoned for years, the windows shattered and covered in grime. The air smelled of smoke and something far worse, something sharp and acrid that made my stomach churn. I felt my pocket and froze. Inside was Matt's journal. My hands shook as I pulled it out, the leather cover warped from water and heat. There was a new note scrawled on the back page, written in the same jagged handwriting I'd seen before, but unmistakably fresh. "You freed me. Thank you." Freed who? Or what? A chill crawled up my spine, and I shoved the journal back into my pocket. I forced myself to my feet, every step toward home feeling heavier, like the air itself was weighing me down. I should have felt relief. The piano was gone, the shadow destroyed. But something was wrong. My hands wouldn't stop trembling. Even when I clenched them into fists, my ears still rang with the faint echo of that haunting melody, playing over and over, as if it were imprinted on my brain. The days passed, but the feeling didn't fade. Every night I dreamed of the piano. It's broken. keys playing themselves, the dissonant tune twisting into screams. I'd wake drenched in sweat, my ears ringing with that same cursed melody. It wasn't just in my dreams either. I started hearing it everywhere, soft, faint notes in the hum of the refrigerator, in the creak of the floorboards, even in the wind outside my window. One evening, weeks later, I took a long walk, desperate to clear my head. I avoided the route that passed the silent keys, but my feet had a mind of their own. Without realizing it, I found myself standing outside another bar. It was nondescript, its neon sign buzzing faintly, but something about it felt familiar. Too familiar. As I turned to leave, I heard it a single note, low and mournful, drifting from inside. My breath caught in my throat, my legs frozen. It was the same cursed melody, faint but unmistakable. My chest tightened as the notes grew louder, layering themselves into that dark, sinister tune I thought I'd destroyed. I backed away, my heart pounding, but the door creaked open. A soft whisper floated out. Carried by the wind, we're not done. Do you hear that faint melody in the silence around you? If you dare, share this story, but remember, every retelling brings it closer to reality. Are you sure you're alone as you finish this story? Or is someone listening, waiting in the shadows? The crate in the corner was rocking again, harder this time. I froze, my flashlight trembling in my grip as the metal chains securing it snapped like brittle twigs. The lid burst open, and something black, wet, and writhing spilled out, its many eyes gleaming as it turned toward me with a sickening, unnatural screech. The silence in the warehouse was suffocating, broken only by the faint hum of the overhead lights and the creak of the old building settling. I moved through the aisles, ticking off items on my clipboard, trying to ignore how the shadows seemed to shift with every step I took. It was just another night, or so I told myself. But then I heard a sharp thud from the far corner of the room. My chest tightened. The sound had come from the crate, the one I'd noticed earlier that week, chained shut and covered in strange symbols. I froze, my flashlight beam shaking in my hand as I strained to listen. For a moment, there was nothing. Then it happened again, louder this time, a heavy, deliberate thud, like something was trying to get out. The crate shook violently, the chains rattling against the wood. My breath hitched as I stepped closer, the sound of snapping metal cutting through the air like a gunshot. The chains fell away, clattering to the floor, and the lid burst open with a deafening crack. I stumbled back, my flashlight slipping from my hand. The beam flickered, casting erratic shadows across the room, as something black and glistening spilled out of the crate. It moved unnaturally, its form shifting and writhing as if it couldn't decide what shape to take. Its many eyes gleamed in the dim light, each one reflecting my frozen, terrified face. Then it screeched a horrible, wet, guttural sound that made my stomach twist. I scrambled backward, grabbing the nearest thing I could find, a metal rod. My heart pounded in my ears as I swung wildly, but the creature was already gone, slithering into the darkness. The warehouse was silent again, but it wasn't the same silence as before. It felt alive, charged with something unnatural. I wasn't alone anymore. I should have quit the moment I saw that crate. I should have packed up, walked out, and never looked back. But I didn't. I needed this job more than I needed to feel safe, and there was no way I could afford to leave. So I came back. The warehouse was the same as it always was, massive, cold, and quiet enough to make my own breathing sound deadening. Towering shelves lined the space, stacked with crates of all sizes. Some were pristine, others covered in layers of dust so thick they looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. A few were marked with symbols I didn't recognize, circles, lines, and jagged shapes that looked like warnings. I'd noticed strange things since my first shift. Crates seemed to move on their own. I'd hear faint tapping sounds, almost rhythmic, coming from the aisles when I knew no one else was there. Sometimes I'd feel a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like I was being watched. I Tried to convince myself it was my imagination, a side effect of being alone in a place this big and empty. But the crate in the corner had been different. Chained shut and covered in strange markings, it didn't look like it belonged here. When I'd asked my supervisor about it, he'd waved me off. "Don't touch that one," he'd said, his tone sharp enough to leave no room for argument. Laughed it off, chalking it up to warehouse politics or inventory quirks. Now, as I stood in the aisle, flashlight in hand, the memory of that crate haunted me. It wasn't just the way it had burst open, or the thing that had come out of it. It was the feeling I couldn't shake, that it had been waiting for me. The sound of the creature's screech still echoed in my ears as I stood frozen in the middle of the aisle, gripping the metal rod like a lifeline. The silence that followed was oppressive, making the faintest creak or shuffle feel deafening. I scanned the flickering shadows, my heart pounding against my ribs. But the thing had vanished. My instinct screamed at me to run. But where? Warehouse felt endless, a labyrinth of shelves and crates. And now it wasn't just a workplace, it was a hunting ground. A wet, dragging sound broke the silence, sending a jolt of adrenaline through me. It came from somewhere deeper in the warehouse, the noise unmistakable, something heavy being pulled across the floor. My flashlight beam wavered as I pointed it in the direction of the sound. The light caught faint scratches along the concrete, deep gouges that trailed ahead into the darkness. They weren't there before. I followed the trail, each step slower than the last. The scratches became more jagged, almost frantic, as though whatever had made them had been thrashing. My stomach churned when the claw marks ended in a streak of dried blood smeared across the floor. The crimson stains looked old, but they were unmistakably human. A lump rose in my throat. Whatever had been in that crate wasn't the first. I turned a corner, and my flashlight flickered, casting the warehouse into sudden darkness. The of the overhead lights faltered, leaving me in a silence so heavy it felt alive. Then, a sound broke through the void, a faint, rhythmic thud. It wasn't coming from one place, it was coming from all around me. I swung the flashlight toward the nearest crate, and my blood ran cold. The lid was trembling. At first it was a faint shiver, but then it grew stronger, louder, until the entire crate shook violently. Stumbled back, my breath coming in short gasps as the thuds grew louder, echoing from all directions. More crates began to tremble, their lids rattling like something inside was desperate to escape. A metallic creak made me spin around. One crate, larger than the others, tipped slightly before slamming back onto the floor with a resounding crash. I couldn't move. My legs were locked in place, my chest tightening as I watched the crate rock violently. Whatever was inside wasn't just alive, it was furious. The sound of a loud snap jerked me out of my trance. A nail popped out of the lid, landing at my feet. Then another. The crates weren't just shaking, they were breaking open. I bolted, my footsteps echoing through the warehouse as the rattling crates faded behind me. My lungs burned with every breath, but I couldn't stop. I turned into a side aisle, hoping to lose whatever was chasing me, if anything was chasing me, and found myself in front of a door I hadn't noticed before. The words "supervisor's office" were faintly visible on the worn glass. I shoved the door open and slammed it shut behind me, my hands trembling as I locked it. The room was small, cluttered with old filing cabinets and stacks of dusty papers. My flashlight illuminated a desk covered in cobwebs, and on top of it was a leather-bound journal, warped with age. It looked out of place, as though it had been left there deliberately. I opened the journal, my hands shaking as I flipped through the brittle pages. It was dated over a decade ago and belonged to someone named Thomas. As I read, my stomach dropped. The entries described experiments conducted in the warehouse crates filled with subjects meant to harness some kind of supernatural energy. But something had gone wrong. The subjects weren't just alive, they were changing. One entry made my heart race. The crates are starting to shake on their own. I can hear them At night, even when everything is locked down, they're getting stronger, smarter. If we don't contain them, they'll break free. I've seen what they can do when they feed, and it's not just physical. They take more than flesh. They take everything. The final page stopped me cold. If you're reading this, it means I failed. Don't open the crates. And whatever you do, don't let them feed. A sudden, loud bang came from outside the office door, making me jump. The journal slipped from my hands, landing with a soft thud on the floor. The sound came again, heavier this time. Like something massive was throwing itself against the door. My flashlight flickered, casting shadows that seemed to crawl across the room. I backed away, my heart pounding as the door groaned under the pressure. The rattling of the crates in the warehouse grew louder, their lids splintering as something far worse than I'd imagined began to wake. The journal hit the floor with a dull thud, but I barely noticed. My attention was fixed on the door. The loud, heavy bang echoed again, followed by a slow creak as if something was pressing against the other side. My breath hitched as the door rattled, the handle twisting, once, twice before going still. Then the silence shattered. A deafening crash erupted from the warehouse beyond the door, followed by a cacophony of splintering wood and guttural screeches. My stomach churned as I realized what it was. The other crates were breaking open. The rattling was everywhere now, the sound growing louder and more frantic. The walls seemed to vibrate with the force of it, dust raining from the rafters as the creatures inside the crates tore free. I backed into the far corner of the office, clutching a rusted metal pipe I'd found in the mall. Clutter. My knuckles turned white around the grip. I didn't even know if it would do any good, but it was the only thing I had. The door burst inward, the hinges groaning as it slammed against the wall. One of the creatures slithered into the room. Its skin glistened, black and slimy, its long limbs bent at impossible angles. Dozens of eyes blinked across its face, each one locking onto me with a predator's focus. My breath came in short, shallow gasps, and my legs threatened to give out. It let out a guttural growl, low and reverberating. Before lunging at me, I swung the pipe with every ounce of strength I had. The metal struck its side with a sickening crunch, and the creature reeled back, screeching in pain. But it didn't leave it scuttled into the shadows, its many eyes glowing faintly as it watched me, waiting for another chance. The lights flickered overhead, plunging the room into intermittent darkness. In the flashes of light, I saw it disappear into the warehouse, but the sound of breaking crates and wet slithering continued, louder than ever. I knew this wasn't over. It was only beginning. I bolted out of the office, the chaos engulfing me immediately. The air was colder now, biting against my skin. The shelves seemed to shift as I ran, the towering stacks of crates closing in around me like a maze that wanted to trap me. My flashlight flickered as I darted through the aisles, my every step echoing in the vast, monstrous space. A loud growl erupted behind me. I turned just in time to see another creature dart between the shelves, its limbs moving unnaturally fast. My heart pounded as I sprinted toward what I hoped was an exit, but the warehouse seemed to stretch endlessly. I couldn't escape. I wasn't sure. There was a way out. I found a moment of stillness in the corner of the warehouse, crouched behind a stack of crates. My chest heaved as I struggled to catch my breath. My phone was in my pocket, and with shaking hands, I pulled it out and dialed for help. The screen flickered, the signal cutting out, repeatedly before dissolving into static. Then came the whispers. They were faint at first, barely audible, but they grew louder as the static hissed. They weren't words I recognized, but the tone was unmistakable, angry, desperate, and wrong. I threw the phone away, the sound cutting off as it clattered to the floor. I had to think. My supervisor's words came back to me, "Don't touch that one," but now I knew. That crate wasn't the only problem. This entire place was cursed alive, even. The journal had said the creatures were changing, growing smarter and stronger. I couldn't stay hidden forever. they'd find me. A wet, slithering noise broke the silence, followed by the faint clicking of claws against concrete. My heart sank. They were close, circling, waiting for me to move. I held my breath, gripping the rusted pipe tighter, praying they'd pass me by. But they didn't. A soft growl rose from the shadows, followed by the unmistakable sound of something sniffing the air. I ran. My legs screamed in protest, but I pushed forward, weaving through the aisles. Creatures' growls grew louder, their claws scraping against the ground as they gave chase. Didn't dare look back. I turned a corner and stumbled into a room I hadn't seen before. The door slammed shut behind me, muffling the sounds of pursuit. The room was filled with old blueprints and documents, scattered across a table. My eyes scanned the papers frantically until one caught my attention. A map of the warehouse. The map highlighted a chamber below the main floor, labeled Containment Core. Scribbled notes in the margins caught my eye. Core as the source. Must be destroyed. My stomach twisted. This was what the journal had hinted at, the center of the energy that had corrupted everything here. The creatures howled outside the door, the sound of their claws scraping against the metal, growing louder. I didn't have much time. If the core was my only way out, then I had to find it. But I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was waiting for me down there might be worse than the creatures I was running from. I gripped the journal tightly, its pages trembling in my sweat-slicked hands as I scanned the map. Once more. My breath came in short, panicked bursts, the howls of the creatures echoing outside the room. The path to the containment core wasn't far, but it meant going deeper into the warehouse, into the very heart of whatever nightmare this was. My stomach twisted as I looked at the hatch in the corner of the room, rusted and half hidden beneath a stack of crates. It seemed ancient, like it hadn't been opened in years. The banging on the door grew louder, claws scraping against the metal. They would get through any second now. With shaking hands, I grabbed a wrench from the desk and shoved the crates aside, revealing the hatch. The smell hit me instantly, a rancid mix of decay and something metallic like rotting blood. My stomach lurched, but I didn't have time to hesitate. I yanked the hatch open and slipped inside, my feet clanging against the metal rungs of the ladder as I descended into the darkness. The air grew colder the farther I went, each breath clouding in front of me. The walls were damp and covered in patches of something that pulsed faintly under my flashlight. It wasn't molded, it was alive, quivering as if it could sense my presence. My heartbeat pounded in my ears as I stepped onto the concrete floor of the chamber. The darkness was absolute, but my flashlight caught glimpses of the walls, covered in jagged carvings and strange symbols that glowed faintly, pulsating in rhythm with the living patches. Then I saw it. At the center of the room was the core, a massive, glowing orb encased in cracked glass. Its surface swirling with dark, inky shadows that moved like smoke trapped in a jar. Crates surrounded it, their lids nailed shut, but I could hear faint scratching and whispers coming from inside. My legs locked in place as a wave of nausea washed over me. The journal had warned me, but seeing it in person was worse than anything I could have imagined. A low growl echoed from behind me, snapping me out of my trance. I turned to see the creatures at the edge of the chamber, their glowing eyes watching me from the shadows. They didn't move, almost as if they were afraid to enter. But as I took a cautious step closer to the core, their growls grew louder. The largest of them a hulking mass of slick, black limbs and writhing tentacles took a hesitant step forward. I clutched the wrench tighter, my pulse racing. I had to destroy the core. If the creatures weren't protecting it, they were tied to it. But every step I took toward it seemed to agitate them more. Their growls turned into deafening howls. And I knew the moment I touched it, they would attack. The air in the chamber grew heavier as I approached the core, the wrench trembling in my grip. The glowing orb seemed to pulse in time with my heartbeat, its dark shadows swirling faster as if it knew I was coming. The creatures surged forward, their screeches piercing the air. My Breath hitched as the largest one leaped into the chamber, its claws scraping against the floor as it charged toward me. I swung the wrench wildly, the metal connecting with a sickening crunch against its slimy body. It recoiled, screeching in pain, but the others were closing in. I darted toward the core, my hands fumbling as I pulled the flammable chemicals from my bag. The journal's instructions were clear. This was the only way to stop it. As I unscrewed the cap, the core pulsed violently, sending a wave of energy through the room. The force knocked me back, and for a moment my vision blurred. When I opened my eyes, I wasn't in the chamber anymore. I was surrounded by flashes, visions of people screaming, their bodies twisting as the creatures consumed them. Their faces blurred, but their pain was real, their voices echoing in my mind like a chorus of agony. My head throbbed as the images dissolved, leaving me on my knees in front of the core. The creatures were inches away now, their glowing eyes fixed on me. My hands shook as I poured the liquid over the glass, the smell of chemicals mixing with the stench of decay. The largest creature lunged, and I barely dodged, the heat of its breath brushing against my skin. Struck a match, the tiny flame flickering in the cold air. "Stay back," I screamed, my voice cracking. I threw the match. The explosion was immediate. The flames engulfed the core, its glow intensifying as it let out an unearthly scream. The glass shattered, sending shards flying in all directions. The creatures howled in agony, their bodies convulsing as the light consumed them. One by one, they collapsed, their forms disintegrating into ash. The chamber shook violently, the walls cracking as the energy from the core burst free. I stumbled toward the ladder, my lungs burning from the smoke and heat. Behind me, the orb let out one final, deafening shriek before imploding, the force throwing me against the wall. When I opened my eyes, the chamber was silent. The core was gone, its light extinguished. The creatures were nothing but ash, scattered across the floor. But as I climbed the ladder, coughing and shaking, I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't won. The silence didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a warning. I stumbled out of the warehouse just as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon. My body was battered, my limbs heavy, and my breath came in short, sharp gasps. The cold morning air stung my skin, but it wasn't enough to clear the thick, suffocating fog in my mind. The silence around me felt too loud, too wrong, like the calm after a storm that wasn't truly over. I turned back toward the warehouse. Smoke curled up from its broken roof, mingling with the pale morning light. The building was still, its once menacing walls now sagging as if exhausted. The crates, the core, the creatures, it was all gone. Or so I tried to convince myself. My trembling hands fumbled with the journal I'd taken from the office. I flipped through its worn pages, desperate for some reassurance that it was over. But as I reached the end, my heart sank. A new line had been added to the final entry, the ink fresh and glistening. "You didn't destroy it. You only set it free." My stomach dropped. The words blurred as my vision swam with panic. What had I done? Thought I'd ended it, thought I'd destroyed whatever was buried in that cursed place. But the journal was clear. The core wasn't the source. It was a prison. And now whatever had been contained there was loose. A low rumble vibrated beneath my feet. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The tremor was faint but unmistakable, like something shifting deep within the earth. It grew stronger, the ground quaking beneath me as a distant, familiar screech cut through the air. My blood turned to ice. It was the same sound I'd heard when the first crate broke open, the same guttural, otherworldly howl that haunted my every step. I stumbled backward, my eyes darting to the horizon. The forest beyond the warehouse seemed to darken, the trees swaying unnaturally despite the still air. Shadows flickered at the edges of my vision, moving faster than they should, too fast to be real. But they were real. They were coming. My legs refused to move. The weight of the realization pinned me in place. I hadn't escaped. The nightmare wasn't over. It had only just begun. The core is broken, and now the shadows roam freely. They linger in places we don't. Notice dark corners, empty rooms, forgotten buildings. If you dare, share this story. Remember, every retelling invites them closer. Are you sure you're alone as you finish this story? Or is something watching you from the corner of the room, waiting for the light to fade?